Hi, I'm Deanna Jo, and welcome to my channel, Responsible Faith. This is the last video in this series, and if you've been following along, you know that sexual abuse survivors from Calvary Gospel Church in Madison, Wisconsin, filed an official complaint with the United Pentecostal Church against Reverend John Wesley Grant earlier this year. And this report was concerning John Grant covering up and failing to report sexual abuse in his church, and for promoting the predators into ministry. And I just want to kind of clarify up front here, like the UPC has very limited power in what they can do here. Obviously, anything criminal, they can't do anything. If something like that happens, the police and the criminal justice system are the only ones that can enforce any kind of punishment. But they do have authority over their ministerial licensing. And so this complaint basically called for a review of John Grant's ministerial standing within the organization. So in mid-March, the Wisconsin district opened an official investigation into John Grant based on the complaints they received. And then the process came to an end on July 21st of this year, with participants in the official complaint receiving a letter from Jim Booker explaining the outcome of the whole process. And Jim Booker is the district superintendent for the Wisconsin district. Now, all of the participants received the final letter except for Rebecca Martin Bird. And she did file a bit later than everyone else, and I was told that he didn't acknowledge her because she emailed her letter instead of snail mailing it hand signed. So that seems a little ridiculous. But anyway, basically the gist of the letter said that, in response to the complaints, that they had put together an investigative committee based on the judicial procedure outlined in the UPC manual, and that the committee met with survivors, they documented the information, and they put together a report for the Wisconsin District Board in May. And actually, Jim Booker had recused himself from that. I believe I mentioned it earlier, because it could potentially be seen as a conflict of interest because he is good friends with John Grant, the accused. So the district board, after assessing this report, felt there was only one clear violation of the UPC manual. And for the record, it wasn't the minor sexual abuse cover-ups or John Grant failing to report them to police when he found out. It was his promotion of Glenn Usselman into licensed ministry after he'd found out what Glenn had done. And this is why some of us are so vocal about the need for UPC policy changes, because, if it's not a clear violation in the manual, there is no clear recourse, even for egregious offenses like a pastor not reporting or covering up minor sexual abuse in his church. So from there, based on the report, the district decided to move forward with a trial, and they made this final report available to John Grant. And after reading it, and I suspect being strongly advised to, he wrote a confession and apologized to the UPCI for writing a reference letter for Glenn to obtain his minister's license. Now, John Grant did not acknowledge the victims or his deceptions about reporting, nor his role in covering anything up. His contrition was reserved for his beloved organization, which I think says a lot. This would have been the perfect opportunity for an old man to humble himself and make some things right. He did not. Now, his confession eliminated the need for a trial and basically just bypassed that and sent things directly to the Wisconsin District Board for action. And they considered the findings of the report and his confession and gave him a 1-year probation. So this means he can't preach or teach for a year, which is something that he wasn't doing anyway. So it's more of a symbolic punishment. Now, the last paragraph of the letter was the one that made me cringe. And it basically said, the district board understands that it's been a difficult time for survivors, thanks them for their patience, assures them that they treated the matter with gravity and integrity, and then signs off with prayers that this will bring a degree of satisfaction to their concerns. Considering survivors went into those interviews, sat with 4 men they didn't know, poured out their hearts for hours, sharing intimate details of sexual abuses they experienced as minors, at the hands of men in various leadership positions in the church, and then talked about the secondary abuse that they experienced from their pastor's mishandling of it, and then the reaction of their church family, which really drove many of them from the church and in a lot of cases from faith. This final letter just felt cold and detached, like it was lacking, in my opinion. No compassion expressed for their personal suffering or any acknowledgement of the monumental journey of trying to heal over the last number of decades. I mean, this has been life-changing for survivors. And whether it was the intention or not, the letter came across very businesslike with a hint of, I hope you're happy now at the end, you know. I mean, that's how it came across to me. And that's where I think there was more room for integrity. This wasn't just a matter. This was about real people, almost an entire generation of girls, spiritually abused and driven from the church by their pastor. And I'm sad that Jim Booker didn't allow the love of Christ to flow through him in this letter, like on a personal level toward the survivor community. This measured, careful approach is why so many view the institutional church as a heartless business and not as an extension of Christ. Now, I do think that the details of John Grant's mistreatment of survivors and the cover-ups were considered when Jim Booker and the Wisconsin district decided on John Grant's punishment. Because, I mean, you have to keep in mind, that stuff was not part of the charge that was brought against him. It was basically just that he promoted Glenn Usselman to get his preacher's license. And so, you know, I do think based on the punishment, the 1-year probation, I do think they considered the other things, because there were even some within the organization who were surprised that the probation period was that long. And so I appreciate that. Like, I really do. And I realize that John Grant remains a looming presence over that district, but I have to say that the letter felt a little bit cowardly. You know, admit nothing in writing. I assume that it might have served to avoid potential future litigation or maybe to avoid bad press, but it was disappointing. And Jim Booker not sending a final letter to Rebecca felt callous as well. I mean, was this really the time to nitpick unimportant specifics of the procedure to basically exclude the lone witness whose situation produced the offense they punished John Grant for? This was a witness who voluntarily sat for 2 hours with the investigative committee and retold her story. And, you know, I really believe she deserved a response. And the transcripts of Glenn Usselman's criminal trial were an issue as well. You know, several of us brought them up, and survivors were told the UPC couldn't afford them. And in that trial, John Grant was forced to testify about what he knew of Glenn Usselman's abuses, how he handled it, and the environment at Calvary Gospel Church. And I just want to be clear that nobody from that district in leadership showed up at the trial to see what was going on. Along with John Grant's testimony, they would have heard several survivors testify about their abuse and how it was mishandled at Calvary Gospel Church. And I mean, it's possible, had there not been a confession and the judicial process had gone to trial, that the survivor community could have pressed them to get the transcripts to use as evidence. But as it stood, they were left with the impression that the transcripts were off the table. And that understandably frustrated them, and it frustrated me. Now, John Grant's confession kept survivors from having to endure a trial, but it also kept the details of his behavior from being exposed to the Wisconsin District Board. And I doubt a trial would have produced a greater punishment for that one charge, but I know that some survivors were disappointed by that. And I mean, again, on the flip side of that, there were probably others who were relieved that they didn't have to go and sit and be cross-examined and give testimony. Now, it's no surprise that John Grant respected the UPCI enough to confess and to apologize for sinning against them. but showed no compassion or respect for survivors. I mean, his pattern of behavior all along showed no respect for these women, even when they were young girls attending his church, and he was supposedly their pastor or shepherd. And I gotta say, unless he makes some things right before he hits his deathbed, he might be surprised when he stands before God. You have to wonder if some of these guys ever believed what they preached, or if this was just an easy career path for them. Some of them spent decades screaming behind the pulpit about the fear of God, and they preached hell hot and, the necessity of constant, fearful repentance. Many offered no assurance of salvation to their nervous saints and painted God as an angry tyrant. But then the leaders' personal lives tell a different story. So, was this all just a game for them? They'd bring the hammer down hard if a girl painted her fingernails, but then quickly forgive and cover up adult predatory behavior and even absolve themselves of responsibility as leaders to protect the vulnerable. Some of them lied and they hid things and they weren't humble or loving, but then they somehow had confidence in their own spiritual standing. And the clergy laity distinction they observed involves a double standard. And it's basically rules for thee, but not for me. And I just want to be clear, when toxic pastors side with abusers and instill fear in the victims, they do not represent Jesus. So in other John Grant news, after this process concluded, he was swiftly and permanently removed from the Order of the Faith, which that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin district. That was a decision that was made higher up. And I really credit Lisa Ruddy and David Bernard with stressing the importance of that. And when I say swiftly, the second the survivors received their letter, that bio for John Grant was gone from the Order of the Faith website for the UPCI, and he was out. And I was also just informed that John Grant was removed as a UPCI honorary general board member. And that happened when the general board met last month at general conference. And that was also a decision made higher than the Wisconsin district. That's not something they would get to decide on. And I credit David Bernard with that. I do. Now, I do have some reservations about how effective some punishments are if nobody makes them public, except those of us, outside the UPC community. If spiritually abusive ministers are allowed to just quietly fade away from their positions and activities, for the length of time of their probation, saints in their districts will never know to be careful of them if they ever decide to change churches or pastorates. And I can assure you, John Grant never allowed survivors to quietly fade away from any scandal. He made it a point to make a public spectacle of them through forced public confessions, or, in many cases, and this would be in Debbie's case as well, through just sharing the private details that were disclosed to him in his office with his family members, which trickled down through the grapevine and to members of the congregation, who then distanced themselves from her. And I tend to think when there's a UPC judicial proceeding resulting in a ruling with any licensed minister that has anything to do with abuse, be it spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, cover-ups, I think it should be announced over the pulpits of that district. I think saints have the right to know these things for safety reasons. So after the final ruling and the letter was sent out, David Bernard made himself available for a Zoom meeting with the survivors who participated in the investigation process, so they could say whatever they wanted to say to him. And Debbie was the only survivor who chose to attend, and I attended as a support for the survivor side. So it basically just ended up being Debbie and myself and Lisa Reddy and David Bernard. And I will say this, I found David Bernard to be compassionate and sincere in that meeting. There were times Debbie made good points about failures in this process and even about cultural issues. within some general areas of the UPCI. And he did not go on the defensive. He didn't make a bunch of lame excuses. There were times he even agreed with her that, there was room for improvement in some areas. And he expressed his sadness and sympathy for what she and the other survivors had experienced. And I felt like he meant it. I was pleasantly surprised with how that meeting went. I went into it kind of braced for it to be a UPC infomercial. I don't know, that's just my cynicism. Every time I interact with licensed UPC ministers, I brace for that. But it was not. It ended up being about the survivors, and it was not a defense of the UPC. And I found he was realistic about the way things are, and his tone was genuine and heartfelt. So the UPC still has a lot of work to do, and I am glad that David Bernard was reelected at General Conference this fall for that very reason. I keep saying that I disagree with him on so many doctrinal points, but I think if there's any hope for positive change when it comes to how abuse is handled in the United Pentecostal Church, he is the best shot we have of seeing that. No other general superintendent has addressed this issue, and one was even accused of covering up for a family member, and that situation did not go away and came back to bite that family a few years ago. So, I know some of my viewers might think that I sound pro David Bernard. Doctrinally, no. But when it comes to this issue, I really do feel like he is the best shot we have of things improving. And I also think Lisa Reddy is a great fit for the chair of the Safe Church Committee. I feel like she genuinely cares about survivors and the safety of people within the church. And as someone with her own survivor story, I feel like she gets this in a way that other people might not. That all being said, Danny Hood spoke at the Children's Ministry Service at General Conference this year, and I know I've mentioned it previously, but it's still bugging me, and so I'm bringing it up again. And, sometimes with the UPC, I don't know, it just feels like one step forward and two steps back. He was a horrible choice for speaker, considering his accusations of failing to report minor sexual abuse in his own church, and that he refused to testify in court at one of the cases, citing clergy privilege as his loophole. And I suspect his testimony would have helped the victim. So, I get it. Yes, maybe General Conference organizers didn't realize his history until Lois posted it on the spiritual abuse page publicly like a few weeks before conference. And the UPC might say, well, he was already scheduled and it would have been difficult to remove him that late in the game and replace him. I have a hard time with that excuse. He would be so easy to replace at the last minute. Do you know how many ministers in the organization would love an opportunity to speak at General Conference? And if a female was scheduled to speak at General Conference and decided to give herself some bangs and a trim 2 weeks before General Conference, and someone posted about it online, we know very well they would be all over that and have no problem replacing her. So if bangs would prompt action, wouldn't it stand to reason that a minister who didn't fully support sexually abused minors in his church was not a good choice for speaker for the organization's annual children's service? And, it's in situations like this that I sometimes question their priorities and their courage as an organization. And I know some UPCers feel like I'm too hard on the organization, but these are important issues. These are issues that you should care about and be vocal about as well. And I don't hear enough of you raising your voices. So here we are. Those of us on the outside are the ones talking about this. I tend to see a defensive posture when I talk about these cases, and I think your silence and your defensiveness is telling. And I may get pushback when I share my critiques, but I back what I say with information and facts. And I mean, I'm now blocked from the UPCI's Facebook page. I watched the Danny Hood sermon live, and I posted a couple of comments. One of them was a link to Lois's blog post about his history, and that blog post was factual and had links to court documents as proof. And then I posted my second comment when he came right out in his sermon and he said that he comes against perversion that would come after our kids. And I thought, what an ironic statement from him. And so I responded with the blog link again and replied, oh, you come against perversion that would come after our kids, ? But didn't go over well, and whoever moderates the UPC Facebook page deleted my comments and blocked me, and that's fine. I mean, that's seen as a badge of honor in my circles, but I will say this. If you don't like the negative comments on your Facebook page, handle things better, and there will be a lot less of them. Hiding and deleting facts is not a good look if you're trying to convince us that you're taking this stuff seriously and you're working toward making the UPC safer. It doesn't hurt to leave challenging or dissenting comments up. You know, I do it on this channel all the time. I leave personal attacks up. Very rarely have I ever removed anything unless it was vulgar or if people said mean things about my family, which I did have a local UPC minister who kind of went that direction. So I removed his comments, but I leave dissenting comments up and I sleep just fine. So my feelings about this process are mixed. And I mean, I guess that's to be expected. In some instances, I felt it was handled clumsily on the district level, and I felt like Jim Booker should have communicated with survivors better, but in other ways, I appreciate that they did anything, knowing that John Grant is basically seen as the patriarch of the Wisconsin district. It's frustrating to me that the UPC policy doesn't have anything solid in it so that you can punish cover-ups and failure to report. But I was glad that they did something. And I do realize that a 1-year probation for the offense he was charged with was a significant response. And I suspect it had to do with the survivor testimonies about the cover-ups, even if they couldn't necessarily specifically go after that. And even though the final letter completely avoided the topic. I can see how the continued development of Safe Church is helpful and has promise for supporting victims and helping people through this judicial process. I was very happy with John Grant's removal from the Order of the Faith and as an honorary board member. It erases a legacy that he doesn't deserve. But I also know nothing would have ever happened had they not been forced to confront this through an official complaint. And, you know, this information has been public for years now and nothing was done. And I really wish there were a policy or some sort of approach to change that. I don't know what the solution would be. Maybe a committee to investigate extreme abuse claims that have not been officially reported but that have public information out there. I guess I just find it awful to think that if a minister abuses someone so badly that they're too broken to report him, that he'll never be held accountable. Things like that bother me. I think true holiness produces people who care deeply about what is right and moral, people who pursue the truth and righteousness in situations, even if victims are too afraid or traumatized to file an official report. I also think that extreme teachings about the man of God or touch not mine anointed, and even obedience and submission to leaders undermine the likelihood of saints reporting pastors for genuine offenses. And in some cases, these teachings are so extreme, I would call them grooming. Never cross the pastor. no matter what. You just leave that to God. Let God deal with them. No, that's not healthy and it's not biblical. And I do have to admit that even though I knew it was a long shot and pretty unlikely, I was a little disappointed they didn't remove John Grant's license, which he doesn't need anymore. I guess considering the decades of destruction he caused, I had hoped they'd be horrified enough that, maybe somehow there'd be a way that he could lose his license. But I still think this was a precedent-setting case for the UPCI when it comes to dealing with abuses of power committed in the past, even decades ago. Just because nobody reported you for misusing your influence doesn't mean you got away with it. And with this case, the UPC has shown that they are willing to go back decades and examine toxic behavior and significant violations of their manual, especially when it comes to the willful promotion of sexual predators. And I know there are old UPC ministers who promoted abusers and perverts into ministry. And in some cases, it was their perverted sons. And I hope that you hear about this and you shake in your boots, and I hope somebody reports you. Holiness is important. Safety in the church is important, and Jesus Christ is our best example of Christian leadership. And what was his example? It was humble servant leadership. And I'll also say that Jesus is our best example of biblical manhood too. These are standards that we should all be able to agree on. So this has been a long process, and I feel privileged to have played a small part in it. At times, it was stressful for everyone, and I wondered if I had made a huge mistake. But I am glad that about a year ago, I started writing this letter to David Bernard. And it's funny, at the end of the final Zoom call, he told me he felt that I had done the right thing by reaching out and ruining his Christmas. No, he didn't say the ruining his Christmas part, but he did feel that my concern and taking action was the right thing to do. And I guess in hindsight, I feel that way too. So if you've experienced or observed abuse from a UPC licensed minister and you feel strong enough to see it through, report them to the district. File an official complaint using the UPC's Judicial Procedure, and I'll link some details for that in the description section. And if you think to yourself, well, there's no point in reporting because my district's corrupt or he's well connected, whatever, there is recourse for that as well. The general board will step in if the district is not honorable in their handling of these matters. And it doesn't happen often, but it does happen, and it has happened recently. So more people need to report to keep the church safe and to help the UPC better understand how prevalent abuse is. Every case they handle, I think, gives them more skills and experience to handle the next one better, and it allows them to recognize and fix existing holes in their policy. And I also think it fires a warning shot to ministers who would be inclined to mishandle things or to be abusive. The days of people tolerating this are over. The church is hopefully on course to becoming safer. So if you followed this process with me and you enjoyed this video, you can like it and share it. And if you subscribe and hit the notification bell, YouTube will notify you whenever I make a new one. And if you followed this series, I just really want to thank you for watching, and I hope everybody has a great day.